and I will be the moderator of this webinar today. I'm really pleased that we have a very distinguished and diverse group of speakers here today, representing governments, the private sector, and international organizations. Their expertise spans across health and trade policy, from medical devices to pharmaceuticals. Regulatory cooperation can play a key role in facilitating access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics worldwide by enabling trade and reducing burdens on regulatory agencies. The COVID-19 pandemic has, I think, shown us the importance of cooperation for getting medical technologies and products to patients as quickly as possible. Regulators from different countries can work together in various ways to facilitate access to these important medical products, especially in times of urgency when their smooth flow across borders is most needed. This can span from simple dialogue to working together in dedicated forums, to sharing data and relying on each other's work, all the way up to mutual recognition of conformity assessment. And I think our speakers will speak to some of these types of approaches today. Cutting across all of this, we know that trust is absolutely vital for making regulatory cooperation work. And this, of course, takes time and effort to build up. I think it's important to keep in mind that these efforts are very valuable because they can help focus government resources that we know are very scarce on where they are most needed and avoid duplication. And of course, from the trade point of view, regulatory cooperation also helps to reduce trade costs while respecting differences in approaches for ensuring health, safety, and quality. The WTO Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade is a vital forum for members of the WTO to advance their regulatory cooperation efforts. So simply put, I think regulatory cooperation is really important because it helps us respond better, not only to this pandemic, but also to be better prepared for future pandemics and emergencies. So I'll start by asking each of our speakers for some opening remarks. And you, all the participants, you're welcome to pose questions at any time in the questions and answers box right at the bottom of your screen. And we will pick these up after each of our 7 speakers have made their opening remarks. So with that, let's move to our first speaker. Mr. Lawrence Sandrell is the chairperson of the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, and he represents the government of Australia. So as chair of the TBT committee over the past year, Lawrence, you've facilitated discussions between members on how they're adapting their regulations and standards to most effectively respond to COVID-19. So can you say a few words to set the scene from the trade point of view, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Devin. And thank you for this opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic represents an unprecedented disruption to the global economy and world trade. And this in turn has affected the health crisis itself. As you've mentioned, trade plays an important role in ensuring the availability and affordability of medicines, medical products, and health services. No country is entirely self-reliant. I'm sure we can all think of relevant examples, including access to PPE, ventilators, medical equipment, and vaccines. The WTO is the only global organisation dealing with the rules of trade between nations. Its role includes to negotiate new rules, to monitor implementation, and to settle disputes. The WTO, to assist with the COVID-19 situation, has created a discrete webpage in which to compile information of the measures that members have implemented. Around 2/3 of members' notifications received in response to the COVID-19 pandemic relate to product standards, to regulations, and to procedures to assess conformity with such measures. These mainly relate to trade in personal protective equipment, food, medical equipment, plant products, and live animals. As such, the technical barriers to trade and sanitary and phytosanitary agreements are a focus of these measures. The TBT, or Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, is one of two agreements that directly address measures to protect public health and public safety, the other being the Sanitary and Photosanitary Agreement. The TBT agreement aims to ensure that technical regulations, standards and conformity assessment procedures are non-discriminatory and do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade. Essentially, governments are required to notify other members through the Secretariat of proposed measures that may have a significant impact on other members' trade and that are not based on international standards. For instance, once a draft measure has been notified, a recommended 60-day comment period begins, during which members can request copies of the draft measure and make written comments on that draft measure to the notifying member. While the TBT agreement strongly encourages the use of international standards, it recognises members' right to implement measures to achieve legitimate policy objectives, such as the protection of human health and safety. In our committee meeting here today at the WTO, members are raising specific trade concerns with each other to find out more about the scope and implementation of these measures. Approximately 90 of these trade concerns will be discussed. This work is supported by publicly available tools, such as the EPING notification system, which enables people to receive daily or weekly emails about notifications that are being made and to search for notifications of products of interest. As you can appreciate, one of the main challenges facing regulation of non-tariff measures is where to draw the line between protectionist and non-protectionist tariff measures. There's no set definition of regulatory cooperation, as you've pointed out, and its application does vary completely from dialogue right through to harmonising measures and adopting international standards. The WTO itself as an international body is an example of regulatory compliance. Similarly, the TBT committee with its members is another example where we meet and discuss and cooperate. Indeed, the TBT committee has inbuilt into the agreement provision for cooperation. Article 2.7, for example, provides that members shall give positive consideration to accepting as equivalent technical regulations of other members. Members have relied on regulatory cooperation with other members as a basis in the COVID-19 pandemic for easing procedures and expediting access to essential medical equipment. For example, Canada allowed imports of hand sanitisers, disinfectants and PPE that are authorised in other jurisdictions with similar regulatory frameworks. Brazil, instead of conducting its own inspections of pharmaceutical manufacturers, decided to accept information directly from other regulators that participate in the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme and the Medical Device Single Audit Program. Brazil also directly accepted certification of ventilators and other medical devices under the Medical Device Single Audit Program. Just for a couple of examples. A common feature to regulatory cooperation is the forward-looking nature that there is a need to be in touch before systems become entrenched. Another inherent aspect is transparency, this sharing of information. It also needs a rule-based setting. It isn't possible to cooperate if the other party is operating inconsistently. The TBT committee, with its system of early identification of issues, such as the commenting on draft regulations and the sharing of information, provides a solid foundation to facilitate and to cooperate with trade and to assist with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Devin.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for setting the scene so well and for elaborating more on the role of the WTO and the TBT agreement and committee. indeed in this space of regulatory cooperation. Our next speaker is Dr. Petra Dur. She is the head of unit, regulation and safety, access to medicines and health products division at the World Health Organization. So Dr. Dur, can I please turn to you now to set the scene from the health perspective? What is the role of regulatory cooperation for promoting access to medical technologies, including during the pandemic? And how can this cooperation ensure safety, quality, and efficacy of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, while also getting access for patients as quickly as possible? So please, over to you.
Thank you, Devin, and please excuse my ignorance, but this is not the time when I should share my slides. This will be at a later stage.
No, please go ahead and share your slide.
Oh, okay, very good then. So I'll start by saying, I started to work in regulatory affairs on the government side in 2004. And this was with Swissmedic, the regulatory authority, the national regulatory authority here in Switzerland. And at that time, the regulatory authority had one cooperation agreement, information sharing agreement, which was with the US FDA. In these years, since 2004, I think international cooperation really has received a boost and has increased dramatically. So what I'd like to share with you are some introductory slides to set the scene from the perspective of the national regulatory authorities and also the World Health Organization. So first of all, just looking at the environment and the evolving science and regulatory challenges, which are also one of the reasons why, some of the reasons why international cooperation in the area of regulation is becoming more and more important. We have a globalization of the markets and also of the supply chains, which have increased in flexibility, as shown on the graph. Health technologies become ever more sophisticated, requiring also the competencies on the side of the regulatory authorities to being able to deal with them. There's also a rapid evolution of the regulatory science behind the work that regulators are doing, and from the public side, growing expectations regarding transparency and also the justification of decision-making. And overall, there's a lack of global regulatory resources, and this applies not only to the smaller countries or smaller NRAs, it also applies to the more well-resourced ones. So the importance of international cooperation to ensure the safety, quality, or efficacy or performance in the area of medical devices, of locally used medical products, has increased. And regulatory cooperation is also seen now as a way of making best use of the available resources and expertise to avoid duplication and concentrate the regulatory efforts and resources where they are most needed. And I'll come to how this is being done in a second. I'd like to start with two quotes from two well-known figures in the area of regulation. The former CEO of the European Medicines Agencies, Guido Rasi, and Janet Woodcock, who was then the FDA Center Director for Drug Evaluation and Research. And they both stressed that even for organizations like the EMA and the FDA, international cooperation is essential, as Dr. Rasi stressed. And also for the FDA, it is clear that the work they are doing cannot be done in isolation. There is a need for a larger collaborative global approach. So this is coming from two of the largest regulatory authorities, and imagine how this even more applies to some of the less resourced regulatory authorities. So this graph shows, I think, what was also made as an introductory remark by Lawrence. I called it the kind of regulatory cooperation pyramid. And I don't have a reference here because this is kind of my own invention. It has been used in other publications, so I'm using it also from time to time in my presentation still. So the basis, the foundation of this pyramid is harmonization and convergence of the regulatory requirements. And this is used also to establish equivalence among different countries, national regulatory authorities, and also to build confidence and trust. something that was also mentioned as one of the prerequisites of moving to the next level, which is then reliance and work sharing. And this is also something we've seen in the last years, that countries and national regulatory authorities have been taking this step based on equivalent requirements, based on international standards. They have been initiating projects and work in the area of reliance and work sharing. The feature of reliance is that it is still allowing for independent decision making, whereas recognition, which is seen now as a special case of reliance, is mostly based on treaties and also implies recognition of decisions. The upper two levels of the pyramid are now covered in a document that was recently published by WHO, the Good Reliance Practices document, and I have included a reference in one of the later slides. Here, just a few examples. I'm not going to go through this in detail, of some of the initiatives in the area of medical devices and pharmaceuticals, where regulatory cooperation is performed at different levels. And just mentioning maybe one each, obviously ICH is the international platform for harmonization of requirements for the registration of human medicines. Then for the reliance approaches, there are a lot of countries applying abridged application routes, which also means shortened review times for products that have already been approved or assessed by reference countries. And then for the recognition, obviously, there's the well-known example of the mutual recognition agreements between the EU and its partner countries. Now, just 2 words on the Good Reliance Practices document. In the middle, you will see here the definition that WHO has published as the definition of reliance being the act whereby the regulatory authority in one jurisdiction takes into account and gives significant weight to assessments performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decision. Again, here it is important to stress that the relying authority remains independent, responsible, and accountable regarding the decisions taken. And this slide shows a few of the pathways that are already in place involving reliance. And there are obviously procedures which are supported by the WHO, such as the collaborative registration procedure, but also regional networks that have been established in different continents, where groupings of regulatory authorities work together under these networks and rely and work share in different areas. And also here, just to highlight projects under the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, where in the different regional economic communities, there are, for example, joint assessments of marketing authorization applications or joint inspections of manufacturing sites. Now, more or less the last slide here is more specifically to the area of the public health emergencies and how reliance can help in these situations. On the one side, you have a facilitation of the authorization emergency use of the different products that are being used in the pandemic. This can be either based on the WHO pre-qualification emergency use listing, or what we call still the stringent regulatory authority, being one of the ICH member or observer regulators. So this is the aspect in the context of the initial authorization, but there are also reliance approaches that can be applied, for example, to aspects like batch release, where we advocate for the avoidance of retesting of vaccines through reliance on the batch release that has been performed by the releasing national regulatory authority or national control laboratory. And last but not least, reliance can also be applied and is encouraged in the post-authorization phase, for example, in the vigilance of the vaccines, where again, WHO has published a vaccines surveillance manual, safety surveillance manual, which encourages reliance. So you can see that this aspect of reliance is really something that can cover the whole life cycle of a product, also in a pandemic situation. Now, in summary, I would say that regulatory cooperation now is a must for all regulatory authorities, independent of their size or maturity. It's not something that you can kind of opt in or opt out. And the concept of reliance in this overall context of regulatory cooperation is central for the regulatory strengthening, system strengthening activities, but also to increase the efficiency of the global regulation of medical products. And the time is right with an unprecedented level of collaboration, for an unprecedented level of collaboration between regulatory authorities, not only now in the pandemic, but I think what we should also look at for the mechanisms that have been put in place during the pandemic, how we can carry them over in the more non-pandemic situation then, or learn lessons and improve the mechanisms and approaches for a future pandemic. And here, I'd just like to flag two buzzwords that have been coming up and used a lot in this past year. It's about regulatory flexibilities or regulatory agility. And I think this is, for me, it's very much in the context of reliance and approaches that are put in place in the context of the pandemic, where lessons could be learned for a situation following this COVID-19 pandemic. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Devin. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dur. That was really, really useful. I think, indeed, to set the scene and to sort of explain how these different pieces fit together in the pyramid that you showed us, and how reliance works in practice. And I think, in particular, the last comments that you made were very interesting. How can we carry over these mechanisms and learn from what's happened during this pandemic for future pandemics and be more agile looking ahead? So with that, thank you very much. Now we will turn to our next speaker, who is Dr. Pauline Wairimu. Dr. Wairimu is representing the Pharmacy and Poisons Board of Kenya. So, as the chair of the African Medical Devices Forum, can you please tell us a bit about what's happening in that context in response to COVID-19? And can you maybe also share some of the challenges that you face in Kenya in strengthening regulatory cooperation? So I believe you also have some slides, so now would be the moment to also share those.
Thank you very much, Devin. I'm just sharing my screen there you go. Thank you very much for your very, very nice introduction. My name is Pauline Wairimu. I work at the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, the National Medicines Regulatory Authority for Kenya. I head the medical devices and IVD section, which is under registration, but I also double up as the current chair for the Africa Medical Device Forum. And I want to start by giving some brief background about the African Medical Device Forum, and I'll also interchange with Kenya's experience during the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the challenges, some of the regulatory areas that we've had to adjust and become agile, as Dr. Dur has said, and that I believe will give you a really good context of how things have been or are still, as we're still in the pandemic. So the African Medical Device Forum is the continental technical working group for medical devices and IVDs. This technical working group has been in existence for from 2012, I believe. Previously, the name was Pan-African Harmonization Working Party that was developed in Nairobi. The first meeting was the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, along with the African regulators. And there was a need even then to develop a harmonized infrastructure for regulation of medical devices and IVDs, because as you know, IVDs and medical devices, the regulatory systems have been they're still in the infant stages. In 2018, there was a meeting which we usually hold for the regulators, and the name was then suggested to change from the Pan-African Harmonization Working Party to the current Africa Medical Device Forum. And it is in that meeting that myself, South Africa, and the Secretariat, who is WHO, together with Auda NEPAD, were to get put together with a view of ensuring that we can accelerate and fast track the regulatory systems in Kenya, in Africa for that matter. So in so doing, AMDF is charged with ensuring that medical devices and IVDs are safe, of acceptable quality and standard, and meet the performance. But the challenges that have been brought forward by the pandemic have really been the key, the litmus test, I would call. And so in my slide, I'm going to highlight to you the regulatory cooperation. There you go. What are some of the roles we believe that the role in facilitating access to medical technologies using regulatory cooperation in our system? So in 2020, in March, the AMDF quickly put together an AMDF task force that was made up of experts from WHO, national regulatory authorities. I was included. And that was because there were challenges that were immediately seen as being faced by member states, especially in the African region, where very different and diverse regulatory systems exist in our different countries. There was definitely a lack of information, and therefore there was the essence or the feeling that the lack of information was going to breed access and promotion of counterfeit medical products coming into a market. Obviously, with the pandemic, the sheer demands and the needs that came about, there was an opportunity for where there are no systems or infrastructure to bring in whatever was available. So through that, we identified 3 key areas: the need to develop information around diagnostics, in vitro diagnostics, personal protective equipments, which included gowns, face masks, boots, anything that was needed by our countries, ventilators, and the quick, we identified some quick and easy fruits to pick, which was to first of all identify what was happening in our own countries that we could put together out there for everyone to know. That, for example, in Kenya, we developed the list of diagnostics that had been registered by the regulatory authority, was shared, and other countries could proceed to go ahead and have that information. So what Dr. Dor has really shared is important, that using reliance and recognition mechanism, we were able to share information about what our individual regulatory authorities had registered, and this information would then be shared with other countries so that they could fast track and get the information that they needed. The AMDF task force had the leadership, as I stated earlier, drawn from WHO, Auda NEPAD as joint secretariat, and the leadership also, AMDF has its governing structure through the MRH Joint Steering Committee. That's who the technical working group answers to, and therefore it is very much aligned to the harmonization efforts that the continent is looking to get. So the AMDF task force went ahead to develop and share 4 different working groups, and I was chair of the 4th working group, but I'm going to give some highlights of the work that was developed by working group 1, working group 2, 3, and 4. The first working group was charged with the need to develop a list of COVID-19 diagnostics and surveillance tests. Like I said, countries, member states, those of us or the members of the AMDF were asked to share what was registered in our individual NRAs and the information that had been used. For example, in Kenya, we had used reliance and recognition mechanism, where we were able to fast track diagnostics that were already in use through the US FDA, through European Medicine Agency, Swiss Medic, TGA of Australia, Japan's PMDA, and even South Africa really played a key role, because the infection or the pandemic had, by the time the strain, the South African strain was coming through, they had really developed some background work. So there was a lot of information, useful information that South Africa shared with us. And through that, the list of COVID-19 diagnostics and surveillance tests that had been developed and registered by the NRAs were shared across all the members of the AMDF. We are currently around 25 countries that are members of the AMDF, and this quickly enabled countries to pick up, disseminate, and share the accessibility of these products. The second working group was charged with a list of medical devices and other products, surveillance, prevention, control, and case management of COVID-19. Ventilators were quickly and have been a key medical commodity that was needed. Again, we went back to our databases, our countries' surveillance report, and we were able to put together a list of all medical devices that we could find, and the sharing information, manufacturers information, the country's local technical representative. The regulation of medical devices such that in the country, like for example, in Kenya, manufacturer has a local agent, and that agent is the one responsible with the, all the information sharing with the manufacturer who's abroad. So we were able to quickly get information for the local technical representative, and this agent would then be able to communicate directly with the manufacturer. We were able to get information such as the stock quantities, whether there were challenges with importation and what those challenges were, and whether they were dependent on the regulatory authorities and what we could do. Then the third working group was charged with developing of standard operating procedures for handling and reporting substandard and falsified medical products and diagnostics. Interestingly, with this working group, for the first time, previously the standard operating procedures for handling and reporting of substandard and falsified medical products developed by WHO did not include diagnostics, because primarily diagnostics were not, I think they had not really garnered the requirement and the need that the pandemic has really called for. So in this working group, we developed the standard operating procedures for diagnostics and medical devices, and this really helped us and helped all our countries, because we saw in alignment to the COVID-19, there was a lot of philanthropists who wanted to help us, and we didn't know in cases of donations and in cases of products that just end up in our markets, the chances of substandard and falsified medical products gaining entry to our markets is really high, and also businessmen taking advantage of the opportunity that the pandemic had brought. So this was really handy, and it's still being used now. And then the fourth working group went ahead to prepare a guideline on assessment of donated medical devices, including diagnostic tests for in-country during assessment. Like I said, philanthropists we had a lot of countries that were going to share with us, and donations are good. However, donations can sometimes be not of the required standard or not meeting the 2/3 expiry in the case of diagnostics, or where an equipment is donated, but you need the reagents to be able to come along with it for it to actually be able to serve the purpose that it needs to. So these were some of the key areas and challenges that were quickly identified by the task force. We were able to put together and develop I think it was during this period that I really admired that energies and bright minds put together in a record 2 weeks. We were able to really change our regulatory landscape for our countries. I've attached to you below on my slides the more information and a link to the NEPAD publication for the African Medical, and also you can further get some information on the reports for each of these working groups. I'm going to now shift gear to the other area which I pointed, which is PPE manufacturing, and this is Kenya. I'm sharing the case study for Kenya, and this is because Kenya pre-COVID was a net importer. Net importer meaning we relied on importation of practically everything, and here was a challenge posed to us because China was no longer exporting, and even though they were exporting to the wealthier countries, and by the time we were putting in our check, we were late. So we didn't have anything, and we needed to get PPEs to protect our healthcare workers, and so we needed to quickly decide and develop the standards for conformity assessment for PPEs that would be able to enable importation, regulatory approval, and ensure that we were able to convert, make available PPEs for our markets. What I witnessed, because I was sitting in both the Committee for the Regulatory Authority and the Bureau of Standards, the Bureau of Standards were able to quickly have what you see on your slide as KS, stands for Kenya Standards. The Kenya standard being the standard developed for that specific product. For example, KS 2636 of 2016 would specify the materials, composition, type, workmanship, design, sized, test methods, labeling and packaging of surgical masks. And this is what would pass on to our local manufacturers. In the next slide, you'll see the local manufacturers that were identified that could be able to now convert and manufacture these products. KS ISO 11193, this was for single-use medical examination gloves with specifications for gloves from polyvinyl chloride. CE some of the standards you'll see they're borrowed from the CE, and ISO, of course, being the originator for this international standards. And through this exercise, or through this period, again, we witnessed the glory of being able to work together and to be able to harness our internal resources, technical experts, and also be able to get the help we needed from international organizations. From that, Kenya, being a net importer pre-COVID, became a PPE manufacturer by converting her textile manufacturers, becoming a key trade partner with the sub-Saharan countries through exports to PPE. And it's become a really key trading partner with the entire African countries, because we were able to develop enough PPEs to export. That, of course, was enabled through technology transfer from more producers of the PPEs, and this has really enabled in the increase of production of PPEs. This is a warehouse where I had gone to inspect, and I'm very happy because when we went, after we had gone and done the training, shared the information, this textile manufacturer was previously making aprons, fabric material aprons, that was non-PPE, but they were able to convert. And so during this period, we saw 20 manufacturers in the export processing zones, 36 manufacturers of different apparels, which included PPEs, head covers, boots, masks, pretty much anything that we requested. Of that, we had 20 manufacturers of woven and unwoven fabrics for use, and 4 manufacturers of footwear. In this period, Kenya has become a manufacturer, and that is the need and the power of being able to look within, the power to harness resources, the power to have the international partners and partners really work with us. And this is a key highlight with what has been done. I'm going to highlight also some of the things that we were able to pick up on, or I have seen as barriers to regulatory cooperation. And one was, of course, the human capacity. The technical experts and the skill sets that are required to do some of this work is really, really high level. And if you do not have them in country, you must be able to train your people. You must be able to look at capacity building. And this has been one key area that I know Kenya has really been working on, gaining expertise, working very hard to ensure that we can get the human capacity that is needed and necessary to shift and change the landscape. The other thing, as I indicated, was the import-export authorization. Sometimes the documentation that is required and requested of at the point of import-export can actually be a challenge and can bring can stop the requirements for import exports becoming, can stop the commodities that are needed becoming available to a market where the regulatory and the documentation required as too large or too technical. Some importers will not be able to meet that. So we had to relook at the import-export authorization requirements and change them as was required. Tariffs and tax regimes, cross-border authorization, the communication between borders is of course another key area. Well, Kenya would develop her products with internally developed standards and conformity measures. It did not mean that a neighboring country, for example, as we have EAC as our key trading partner, perhaps the requirements are different and they may need us to do something that was not considered in our internal conformity assessment. And this, of course, would delay and at some point, in some areas also prevent the export of products. Language barriers, system barriers, and tariffs, different tariffs that would be called upon can really cause products not to gain access to a neighboring market. Another key challenge that was there is the different levels of regulatory framework. As I said, sitting at the Africa Medical Device Forum, countries have really different regulatory systems and framework. For example, I could say Kenya has been able to implement the regulation, registration, importation, monitoring of pharmacovigilance of products and ensuring that our markets are safe. However, that is not the case with Burundi, a much smaller country and a country that is probably just developing the regulatory framework. In so doing, you find that countries with poor or weak regulatory infrastructure are not gaining and do not get to really get the full measure of what regulatory cooperation is, because countries that are able to push or have better regulatory frameworks attract importers, much easily, simply because an importer or a manufacturer who feels and knows that all the requirements are put out to them, they are able to access a market faster, and they're able to move on to be able to get the product into the market. The other thing is, of course, manufacturing capacity. And this is the case scenario with the current vaccine shortages that we are seeing. We lack the local vaccine manufacturing capacity for the COVID-19 vaccine. And that means that we are again having to rely on the COVAX facility, for example, or the need to rely for other external markets. This, of course, makes it very challenging for us to meet the demands, the internal country demands that we currently have to vaccinating our people. And this also makes it difficult for us to be able to move ahead in terms of addressing the public health needs that we need to be able to address. And again, manufacturing capacity requires a lot of financial research and development capacities, which Africa in general has been lacking, and we've had to rely on other countries. Again, like I said, import over reliance is a challenge, because then when there's when a challenge or there is a bottleneck with regards to importation, the country suffers because you have no product, you have nothing to use. And this, of course, poses a great danger to the public health demand, and ensuring that trade is affected, trade does not come into the country. So supply chain disruptions cause closed borders, and this, of course, means that we are not able to bring products to the markets as soon and as swiftly as we should be able to. Again, duplication of standards as the last point is where standards or where multiple authorities, which is sometimes seen in some countries in Africa, duplication of standards, of course, make it difficult for manufacturers to really understand, or an importer to really understand what it is that they need to bring to enable access of a product. And this, of course, is a challenge that can cause regulatory cooperation. So where are we, and what is the current and future outlook? There are some really exciting programs that are going. The COVAX and COVID-19 vaccine, as I stated, this is a facility that we are currently using in ensuring and looking to be able to get the COVID-19 vaccine. However, there are challenges in that we have few countries that are manufacturing and needing to supply all the countries. And of course, this means that countries are receiving quantities, just enough quantities for the time being. If we had our own manufacturing, we would be able to then accelerate and vaccinate our people, which would, of course, work to ensuring that vaccine hesitancy or ensuring that people do not fear the vaccination process. The pandemic treaty has really been the talk at the just completed the World Health Assembly, and we see that the pandemic treaty, which we are calling on the WTO to request for waiver on these from the manufacturers of the vaccine, could help us be able to open local manufacturing, because like I stated, local manufacturing is really something that we are looking to ensure that we can get to safeguard our countries from the future pandemic. The African Continental Free Trade Area, this is something that, of course, the pandemic slowed down, but we look to a point where we will have Africa Medicine Agency coming and becoming really a useful tool in ensuring that we can, through harmonization, quickly share, disseminate, and make available of essential medical devices in cases of the pandemic or in other health emergencies that can arise in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Wairimu. It was really interesting. I think the example you gave of how Kenya shifted from being an importer of PPEs to being an exporter to all of sub-Saharan Africa, and the key role of adopting standards and conformance frameworks there. And I think it was also interesting how you spoke to some of the challenges and barriers to regulatory cooperation. For instance, countries that may have different regulatory requirements or duplication of standards that can be difficult to cooperate. So let's turn now to our next speaker, Mr. Matthew Smith, who is Executive Director on Technical Barriers to Trade at Global Affairs Canada. Matthew has a long experience on TBT issues. And can I ask you to give us some examples of how Canada is engaging in regulatory cooperation on medical products, and what you see as the benefits for health and trade? So over to you.
Thank you, Devin. Yeah, I'd like to thank our previous speakers as well. I think it should be clear to all participating today that this is a complex area where there's quite a lot going on. And I wanted to take a moment to talk from a national government perspective about some of the concerns and issues that are inherent in this kind of cooperation between national regulatory authorities, and to take it from a trade perspective. So as Devin mentioned, I have some experience in the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee that our previous speaker, the chair of that committee, Mr. Sandrell, discussed, and also in working and establishing some of the regulatory cooperation arrangements that Canada has with other governments. So I would say that from the government's perspective, the first and foremost, cooperating for regulatory reasons is about protecting citizens. And that's the first priority, I think, of governments. And that right to regulate becomes paramount in any conversation about working together with other authorities. It's the cornerstone of what we do. But then the question is, okay, internationally, what can a government-to-government engagement look like to make it easier for products like medical technologies that we're talking about to cross borders, to become more accessible, to be easier to trade? And I think we've heard a lot of detail about the types of arrangements that can be out there. I wanted to say that in addition to cooperating in a moment like the present with the pandemic, a challenge for all of us, there's also value in building these structures to be there for not just for the future, but for any other types of arrangements that that might be contemplated. And so Canada has worked quite hard to try to make some structures be in place that can be adapted and flexible for different types of cooperation, and specifically to allow trade to be facilitated. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about work we've done with the European Union. We have a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU, between the EU and Canada. And in that, we have two mechanisms which I wanted to talk a little bit about. The first is a regulatory cooperation forum. And the idea here is to create a structure that is permanent, but which is very flexible. It sets out parameters to say that different agencies in charge of regulation are able to connect with each other, to identify areas where there might be capacity to share information and to learn from each other. And as there are new challenges, perhaps to develop answers to them together. And from a trade perspective, we find that health authorities, for example, are all working towards the same end: how to make their citizens safe and to ensure efficacy and quality of product that is allowed in for those purposes in that area. But how then can we have that conversation also help with trade? Well, you can identify, I think Dr. Durr mentioned earlier, there's a real across the board challenge for the global lack of regulatory resources. And the more that even the largest regulators can collaborate with each other and share that burden across different areas and establish expertise and trust in different areas, there can be complementary efforts. And so this regulatory cooperation forum that we've established in a trade agreement does allow for this kind of regular engagement, regular meetings that are held annually to identify shared priorities where people can choose to come together. It's always voluntary, and see where those kinds of collaboration can happen. We have something similar that's been established with the United States. It's also a permanent forum, our Regulatory Cooperation Council, and a similar concept there where you are trying to identify how people can share information, connect regulators to be able to be better able to have products approved in a quick way, but also perhaps to decide to solve problems together. From a trade perspective, we heard a little bit, Dr. Rayuma was just discussing how important it can be for information to be clear for importers so that product that's so needed can come in and understand what the rules are. And I think that it's quite valuable to see ability to have that kind of information sharing well established so that you can get good collaboration between regulatory authorities. I wanted to say, when it comes to the pandemic, we have done quite a lot of deliberate efforts that are tied deliberately to this situation. Mr. Sandwell referred to something that Canada has done on hand sanitizers earlier in his remarks, which was a specific action where rather than this kind of permanent structure for cooperation, you simply have a national authority like our own Health Canada saying that for certain disinfectants and hand sanitizers, whether or not they fully meet our Canadian regulatory requirements to be sold, they may not need to do so in certain situations like the present. So if there were questions about labeling or packaging, if they were authorized for jurisdictions where we have similar regulatory frameworks, an evaluation was made to say, all right, how can we let these products in? And when you're trying to move quickly, establishing those permanent structures with other governments is obviously a very tall order when people are focused on the immediate moment. And so sometimes that cooperation can be an element of trust where you understand what other people's systems look like, and you can take the calculated step of letting some flexibility into your system. And so that's one example that we have from the present moment. But another type of activity which I wanted to make mention of today is our work in some of the medical device areas. So there is a single audit program, which I think Dr. Durr made reference to in one of her slides earlier. And this single audit program is something that grew out of initially Canada-United States cooperation, where the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and Health Canada agreed a number of years ago, 15 years ago, to do some audits together and to see what could be made of that. After 11 audits over the course of several years, by 2010, this pilot project had shown that kind of regulatory resource question could be addressed in an effective way. There could be some ability for one audit to meet the requirements of more than one government, two in this case. And then that grew into a larger program. And there are now 5 countries, Australia, Brazil, Japan, along with Canada and the United States, which are fully using this medical device single audit program. But there's a number of observers who are participating as well. Argentina, South Korea, Singapore are affiliate members, and observers from the European Union and United Kingdom and the World Health Organization are participating as well. And I think the value of this is relatively straightforward to explain, but very difficult to set up and does take some time. And that is that a single audit of a site, a manufacturing site, can allow for people to meet the regulatory requirements of their different national authorities. And now that pilot program has been running, there are more than 5,800 medical device manufacturing sites spread out across many countries, which are able to participate in the program. And this has regulatory benefits because a lot of information, expertise, and resource allocation can be managed efficiently between governments. But it's also valuable from a trade and industry perspective, where it's a little more predictable for a number of markets, and you have less time as a manufacturer in the compliance work, because you have a single audit rather than many. So you have less interaction, less time spent in that process. And that ability to look at conformity assessment, to look at the way that people meet regulations in an efficient way, I think is very valuable. So I'd be happy to, if there's time during the panel, to say a little bit more about some of the specific activities which Canada is engaged in. But I hope, Devin, that gives us a good idea of some of the perspective from the national government. And I'll leave my remarks there.
No, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. I think that sets us well. And I think, you highlighted this point about the lack of resources, regulatory resources worldwide. And I think that also speaks to the last example that you mentioned, the medical device single audit program, which helps to alleviate that. And I think Also interesting to hear about some of the permanent regulatory cooperation forums that you have set up and how that helps you to be a bit more agile and work together to solve problems with other governments. So with that, can we move now to our next speaker, Mr. Sauri Goodlavalati, who is the head of research and development at Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. So as a major Indian producer of generic medicines, we'd like to hear your perspective on regulatory cooperation. And in particular, what opportunities exist for regulatory harmonization to enable better access to pharmaceutical products. So I will hand the floor over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and hi, Devin. Thank you for your question. It was quite enlightening to hear the predecessors who spoke. I thought I will further the conversation and build on what has been already said using just a couple of slides. So let me make sure that technology doesn't let me down. I'm assuming we can see the slides, yes. So what I will do is just explain the vantage point from which I'm here to speak, right? So I'm a member of Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which is a $2 billion generic pharmaceutical company. In that we make, our goal is to bring affordable medicines to people around the world. So it's a company of 22,000 people from across 40 nationalities. We currently market over 400 products. That number is rapidly increasing. And we are present commercially in over 42 countries. Right? And our goal is to make every medicine affordable and accessible to people around the world. To just go one step deeper, we are actually present in 42 countries commercially, and some of them are listed on this slide. But in addition, we have a back-end infrastructure to supply to all of these countries: 9 active ingredient manufacturing sites, 13 finished dose manufacturing sites, 9 global R&D centers, which I lead. We also have a biosimilars and biologics development center, etc. So with this kind of an operation, we naturally come across multiple regulatory bodies in our endeavor to bring each medicine to the maximum number of countries. And when we do so, we see a lot of differences, several differences, which we think could be ironed out and resolved, which will improve access to affordable medicines around the world. What has been said by Dr. Durr, Mr. Smith, and the other speakers before me is very true. Significant amount of progress has been made. I have myself seen in the last 6 years since I've been here, significant progress in this area. But I thought I'll spend some time from a manufacturer or a private enterprise perspective, getting into some details of what further needs to be done, right? Because at a policy level, a lot has been done. But when we get into the detail, there is an opportunity to do a lot more. And I thought I'll speak about a few of those examples. So sort of broadly bucketed the observations that I have and we have from our vantage point in 4 areas. And these are not to say that work has not happened. These are to say from how far we've reached, there is more to be done. Let me start with product development and quality, right? So the ICH has been formed, which is a huge step forward. And the ICH guidelines are widely used by many regulatory bodies. Having said that, each country or many countries still continue to carry their own pharmacopoeia. And so when we take the product to multiple countries, we see sometimes conflicting or varying pharmacopoeial requirements, and there is a scope to harmonize those. Similarly, generic development under ICH Q8 could be used by other regulators. It'll just be very simple because if one country approves it, there's a scope to approve these across countries. Similarly, there are specific specifications, impurities, stability. ICH recommendations on these are gold standards, and they are well thought through. However, they're not globally adopted, and so there is an opportunity to adopt these. If these are done, what happens is the time to develop products and the time to be able to port a product or move a product from one country to the other could be reduced, and thereby we could bring medicines much faster to people around the world. So this is on the product development. Now, if you come to manufacturing, we heard a lot. We talked a lot in this meeting so far about unified regulatory inspections, right? Quality inspections. For sure, there is a move forward with the mutual recognition agreement between the US and Europe. There is also PICS. But even after these are there, there is still an opportunity for us to harmonize for these inspections. As you said, trust is probably a big issue. Specific local requirements are big issues. But what could be done is a cooperation between regulatory agencies of multiple countries and these consortiums could be additive in the sense that, okay, if PICS requirements are met, let me assume that that is taken care of, and let's build on what is above and beyond that, which is a country-specific requirement. That way, we reduce the burden and we reduce the time taken to attend and meet these requirements. Now, but that is well known and well spoken about, and I think there's a long way to go there. But there are certain interesting, sort of observations that we have had, right? Different regulators for the same exact product have actually different regulations and manufacturing requirements. For example, certain regulatory bodies prefer terminal sterilization, which is that if you have an injectable product which is sterile, you complete manufacturing of the product and then you heat it to sterilize it. Whereas certain other regulatory bodies are okay with doing what is called an aseptic process, which is as long as you remove the microbes upfront and maintain sterility through the manufacturing process, it's okay. Now, these differences naturally mean that sometimes the same product has to be developed and manufactured in different ways, the same exact product, to meet different regulatory requirements. Another similar example is overages, right? I have a very interesting example of a cancer medicine. And this particular cancer medicine is life-saving. It's very expensive, and when the generic is launched and the generic is now circulating around the world, it significantly reduces the cost. However, because it's a rare indication, the number of doses that each country consumes is merely a few thousand, right? So it doesn't go into millions or hundreds of thousands of vials. When you have a product where you are making one batch or two batches for each country, I've seen it very interesting. All countries require a certain fill volume. In this case, it is 3.5 milliliters in a vial. One country, a developed market, came back and said, we would like it to be 3.51 ml. And they needed it to be that way because they said when we withdraw the injection, there is a possibility that a drop is left behind. So we need to make sure it's 3.5. Now, that's okay if all countries were to agree with the same position and say, let's make it 3.51 for everybody, because it's a very common sense problem. However, different countries wanted it to be different. So now as a manufacturer, we need to produce multiple versions of the same exact product just for 0.01 milliliters. And that makes access, affordability, and speed of delivery, it compromises that. Similarly, we talked in this presentation earlier about local testing and release requirements. These requirements also, there's an opportunity to harmonize. And right now, with let's just say Brexit, there is further complication of additional local release requirements between UK and Europe that we are foreseeing would come up. Clinical guidelines are particularly interesting, right? So different countries expect different clinical study or bioequivalent study requirements for the same exact product. In particular, we see that certain oncology products, some countries are okay with a healthy volunteer study, whereas some others want a patient study. Some countries want a crossover study, some want a parallel study. So because of this, what happens is we end up exposing more number of people and volunteers to an unapproved product. When we get to clinical endpoint-based trials, we also find that the endpoint expectations of different markets and different countries are different. Some of the countries and some regulators we see have actually very well-defined guidances and endpoints, whereas some others are still debating. There is an opportunity for the countries which haven't yet made up their mind to actually borrow the information. A particular other situation that we see is there are many drugs which have no differences across populations. There are certain drugs which do have population or ethnic differences, but when there are no pharmacokinetic differences across markets, we see that there is still an ask in some situations for local population-based studies. Now, when this happens, it just increases the time that it takes to bring the product to the market. In particular, what happens is there are certain products which, as a generic, we see that the innovator whose medicine we're trying to genericize manufactures from the single site, single product, single composition for all the markets. But Each regulator requires that we buy a separate sample of the product marketed in their respective country and to be tested and to be shown as equivalent to this. So one thing is that, yes, this increases cost, but that's a smaller issue for us. The issue is it just increases the probability of failure as well as the time it takes to bring the medicine. Sometimes we see that these oncology products are extremely expensive. We work on products which cost as many as $5,000 to $10,000 per tablet. Right, one single tablet costing $5,000 to $10,000, and we spend millions of dollars in repeating these. And the supply chain of these drugs is as well controlled. So certain times what happens is these products are cytotoxic, so the distribution of it is not openly available, which means that the reference drug is available in one country but not in a different country, and therefore, because of unavailability of the reference drug in one country, the ability to genericize the same molecule even after patent expiry is reduced. This actually only hurts that country's ability to receive a lower cost medicine. So there are opportunities for us to use science-based approaches to show equivalence. Finally, just purely from a regulatory standpoint, right? I think the regulatory workflows, different countries have different regulatory workflows, which is okay. However, there are certain best practices which we see, we are able to see from our vantage point how one regulatory agency follows certain workflows which are more advantageous for everybody. It's a win-win. The process, for example, of scientific advice or agency consultation is now getting set up in certain countries. It's been well present in certain other countries. This is very good. One example is the US FDA. After a tremendous amount of pressure and the need to reduce the cost of medicines, a good scientific agency consultation process has been set up to help bring complex medicines to people through scientific discussion. Now, if the EMA has always had robust process of scientific advice meetings. Now, if such processes could be adopted widely, it just makes it that much easier and faster to clarify gray areas before generic copies can come in. Similarly, there is an opportunity if a certain benchmark or reference regulatory agency has approved a product. It would be good if this information can be used and to speed up approval and launch of products in other countries. The priority review is one such area, right? So because the moment a generic enters the market, the cost of medication can go down anywhere from 10 times to 100 times. In the same area, regulatory data review information sharing will help. Last but not least, and this is a point that we really see practically, is what we see as post-approval change requirements. When you have an approved drug and you need to make certain changes to it in the manufacturing process, often the changes occur because I have an approved drug in one country. Now, a second country has asked us to make certain process changes to maybe, let us say, tighten the specifications or make it better. We would like to comply, but now this has to be reported back to the first country so that they can accept it. Often, this change process is not uniform across markets. So what then happens is one is forced to carry multiple manufacturing processes for multiple countries, which is inefficient. Eventually, we see companies exit markets, right, as a result of this. One of the outcomes of this I've seen is certain countries where the consumption of certain medicines is very small, end up actually not even getting the medicine. I see this live in a country like India, where I'm from. People with certain rare diseases are unable to get their medicines and they have to import it from other countries because the process of registering such a product in India does not exist. And the patient pool population being so small, the clinical trial requirements cannot get met, based on some of these requirements, right? So you end up not being able to deliver the medicine. So I think there are multiple dimensions. What I've tried to do is to give a few examples of very granular problems that could be solved through better regulatory cooperation, which in turn will be a win-win for everybody. I'll close with a final slide, which talk a little bit about COVID response, right? So all of this has been a very live situation in COVID-19. And I must say that, as some of the speakers earlier have said, that in the event of COVID-19, regulatory bodies really came forward to ensure that processes are simplified and that we are able to leverage and bring solutions as fast as possible. I'll probably talk more about it later when, I'll probably talk more about it if we have time for a question. But here's just an example of medicines from the US, Japan, and other parts, Russia and Europe were Europe, Russia, Japan, Canada, and other countries were brought to save patients in India as well as in other countries. So this has been a true situation of being able to form alliances between at a national government level, at a regulatory body level, at a corporate level, as well as at an individual citizen level or a company level, to bring therapeutics and medicines and even vaccines across the board. There's a lot that we've learned in this process, and if there's more time, I'm happy to share further on that.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think it was really interesting to hear you explain indeed some of these, specific problems and opportunities for enhancing cooperation, where more cooperation could help. I think you talked about, for example, more use of more reliance on ICH international quality standards. And I think you gave us some very revealing examples about how differences, very small differences, the difference between 3.5 and 3.51 milliliter in vials can make a huge difference in terms of affordability, access, speed of delivery. So whether those regulatory differences can be ironed out or not. So that's very, very helpful. Thank you indeed. So our next speaker is Ms. Janet Trunzo. She is the Senior Advisor to the President and Senior Executive Vice President, Technology and Regulatory Affairs at the Advanced Medical Technology Association. So as a leading trade association, can you share with us what you see as the opportunities provided by regulatory cooperation for your member companies and the patients they serve around the world? And also, can you mention some best practices that you see for effective cooperation, both in the pandemic and post-pandemic context? So I pass the floor now to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Devin, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about a topic which is very important to the Advanced Medical Technology Association. We are a member of the Global Medical Technology Alliance, which is a consortium of medical technology associations from around the world. We were established about 10 years ago, and the purpose of the work that we do is to promote timely patient access to safe and effective medical technology, and also to facilitate global trade. I bring up the GMTA for the purpose of understanding how we work within the medical device area as a global medical technology alliance of trade associations from around the world. We have gained recognition from the World Health Organization as an NGO, as well as recognition from the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. And this provides us an opportunity to make recommendations and to engage with international regulators. And this is an important part of the work that we do. So what I would like to talk about in answering your questions, Devin, talk a little bit about the challenges that we as medical device manufacturing encountered during COVID. Talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned, and then I'd like to end with some recommendations based on those lessons learned that we actually presented to the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. A lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about here have been mentioned from several of the previous speakers. But what we realized as we got into the pandemic as it pursued, we had realized that there was a need for very rapid review and approval mechanisms to meet the specific needs of COVID. Access to COVID diagnostic tests, personal protective equipment, ventilators were in high demand. So it was essential that we work closely with regulators and developers and healthcare providers to meet the needs for medical devices during the pandemic. At the same time as we were engaged in this work, we encountered some challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that we encountered with diagnostic tests. we have the ability to develop a test is essential. An essential component of that is to have access to samples, viral samples that you can use to ensure that your test is specific and sensitive to the test itself. When our members who manufacture diagnostic tests were engaged in this, not only was the access to the virus samples that were needed to develop the tests, there were differing regulations and from different countries. So the lack of harmonization and regulation for this area was a challenge. And even within the country themselves, the ability to have an emergency use authorization versus a full-blown regulatory approval was so important to get these products into the hands of healthcare providers and patients as soon as possible. So as we pursued this, and we had a regulator like the US FDA who had emergency use authorization policies in place, other regulators also had emergency rapid review policies that allow for these products to get through the regulatory system in a timely way. But some of the lessons that we learned, and this was mentioned previously, were there were the ability to leverage regulatory decisions from other regulators. This was really important, and it was mentioned previously in one of the speakers, because it's kind of a forerunner to the regulatory reliance policies that have been recommended. So if these decisions are recognized and they can be used to quickly approve a use of a product in one country based on the approvals from another country, this was absolutely needed, and it worked well. So having regulatory agility, we heard the term regulatory agility previously during the pandemic, was really important. One of the areas that was mentioned was this medical device single audit program. The medical device single audit program has been around for some time, but what we saw during the pandemic itself, having a single audit program is really important. But the ability to actually do an on-site audit was limited during the pandemic. So the use of a remote audit in place of an on-site audit was also a key method to get these products into the hands of patients and providers. Leveraging the regulatory reliance on decisions and was also a key component of how we were moving towards leveraging other regulatory decisions. So when we saw all of this happening, we had the opportunity to make some recommendations to the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And the reason why this is such an important way to do this is because the IMDRF, similar to ICH on the pharmaceutical side, had developed over the years a global harmonized regulatory model. And this took years of development. It started with a global harmonization task force before the task force was morphed into the IMDRF. But that globalized regulatory model really did contemplate flexibility in regulatory systems to allow for these emergency situations. And the IMDRF guidance documents that are developed under this regulatory model are really important for other regulators as they develop their own regulatory systems. But it's also a way to get harmonization among regulators with these basic core documents. But now that we see the pandemic has occurred, it would be, I think that what we believe is that IMDRF could essentially take on some additional work of establishing specific guidance around the regulatory flexibility needed during a pandemic. Having those processes in place, I think will go a long way to ensure that when there is another pandemic, these are regulatory guidances that can be referenced, and regulators can use those. What would also be important, and another recommendation that we made to IMDRF, was to utilize these reliance mechanisms to promote rapid review and approval. Those reliance mechanisms are starting to get a lot of discussion. They were used during the pandemic. Let's look to using these not only during a pandemic, but actually beyond the pandemic. The importance of developing guidance documents and promoting the use of those guidance documents through adequate training and communication, we believe also will go a long ways to look at these lessons learned that we learned during the pandemic. So I'm going to have just this few minutes here, since we're running a little bit behind here. I just want to close that during the COVID pandemic, the medical device industry was so essential to meeting the public health demands of the pandemic. And the medical device industry did its part in working closely with regulators to ensure that safe and effective medical devices were into the hands of our healthcare system as quickly as possible. And at the same time, we learned some lessons, both regulatory and those kind of lessons that we believe should maybe think about those for the future as as regulatory processes that could be more permanent, not necessary and specific to a public health emergency, but important lessons that we can use moving forward to ensure that we get on time the medical technology, safe and effective medical technology to the patients that we serve. That concludes my comments.
Thank you very much indeed. And I really appreciate those comments. And I think you outlined some very practical challenges. Again, for instance, in developing tests, the need for access to virus samples and the difficulties of lack of harmonization. And I think you had some interesting suggestions indeed about work that could take place in the IMDRF about developing guidance for future pandemics and how we can learn lessons from that. So thank you very much. I appreciate also you sticking to the time, given that the time is indeed short. Just to say that we probably will go over time by perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, hopefully to also allow us to answer a couple of questions. So I hope you can join us for that. So our next speaker is Dr. Renata Amaral. She is with the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence for the Medical Technology Sector, and she's also an adjunct professor at the American University Washington College of Law. So you were here with us to actually at a TBT meeting in February 2020 to talk a bit about the work you're doing on regulatory convergence. And of course, since then, we've had the pandemic. The world has changed significantly. Can you tell us how has the pandemic in general influenced your thinking about how we can build these sort of adaptive and agile regulatory cooperation arrangements for the medical technology sector, and what's needed to deepen this cooperation in preparation for future pandemics? So the floor is over to you, Renata.
Thank you very much, Devin. Indeed, that was my last trip abroad before the pandemic. And I have a presentation here to share. I'm delighted to be here with you again. I'm promising I'm going to try to stick to my 7 minutes. Let me just share my screen very quickly. So Devin, answering to your question, it's very clear to us that the pandemic has actually brought a sense of emergency with regards to all that has happened, and with regards especially to regulatory cooperation, the need for international regulatory cooperation. What is our coalition about? Just very quickly, for those who doesn't know us, actually, our first public engagement was at the WTO last year during the TBT committee. So, and we are very, very pleased to be back here with you. But basically, the vision of the coalition is to have one standard, one test accepted everywhere. The coalition is composed by medical technology associations of the Western Hemisphere and other private and public sector stakeholders. We are composed by 10 countries, 17 regional associations, which are principal members. We have over 3,000 member companies. And we are in continuous dialogue with national regulatory authorities for medical devices, and always advocating for the use of international standards. Our mission is basically to promote regulatory cooperation across the Western Hemisphere to achieve international aligned medical technology regulations, standards, and conformity assessment requirements within a continual process of convergence to maximize patient access to life-saving and improving medical technologies. Here, we bring here a few examples of medical devices, which most of us here, the speakers, have mentioned some of them before me. So personal protective equipment, N19 face masks, gloves, hospital gowns and drapes, sanitizer, respiratory support devices, in vitro diagnostics, etc., etc. Before, when we were preparing for this webinar, Devin, you asked us to talk a little bit about the challenges we face, general challenges in terms of international regulatory cooperation, but also additional challenges that were brought by the pandemic. So one of the main challenges of the medical devices sector is the enormous diversity of products, as we all know, which means different regulations, different standards, different and complex supply chains around the world. So some of the general challenges we have is underutilizing recognition, pre and post-market, lack of electronic review systems and labeling, often improperly regulating medical devices and in vitro diagnostics as pharmaceuticals. This is an old fight of the sector. Regulatory authority and capacity, lack of regulatory authority and capacity, underutilizing risk-based approach. This is another very serious problem. The hundreds of thousands of components that change every 18 months, the huge global supply chain and long global supply chain, the TBT awareness and compliance in the medtech regulatory process, and adoption of good regulatory practice. So these are some of our ongoing challenges, and now the coalition has 1.5 years, and we have been working hard in all those challenges within the region. But some of the additional challenges that were brought by the pandemic are the lack of emergency use pathways, collection use of real-world data while maintaining patient safety, regulatory authority, remote work, agility, capacity, protocols, and authority. The pandemic, leaving other diseases untreated or delayed. This is a very serious problem. So long-term impact of healthcare sustainability. Some lack of regional capacities we have been observing in countries we work with. National versus subnational coordination and enforcement. It's another big struggle of the region. patchwork of these designations as essential industry and government procurement and transparency. Those are some of the additional challenges we have been facing during the pandemic. And again, one of the things we are convinced about is that have all of these been in place before the pandemic, we wouldn't have so much work right now. Although we have had a very important success over the years, as our the previous speakers have mentioned, in terms of regulatory cooperation. So I brought here one a positive example that happened during the pandemic. Actually, Mr. Sandro, the chair of the TBT committee, has mentioned the Brazilian example in the beginning of this webinar. So medical devices in Brazil and in vitro diagnostics are regulated by the National Health Surveillance Agency, Anvisa. In Brazil, the standard process includes registration notification for all device classes and generally takes several months to complete. But in response to the COVID pandemic, Anvisa has made special allowances for products used to combat the pandemic, included under the additional regulations for devices related to COVID-19 and or to SARS-CoV-2. So here are some of the examples of regulations, internal regulations that Anvisa has released during 2020 to facilitate, to simplify requirements for manufacturing, for importing and purchasing medical devices, for example. This presentation is going to be available afterwards in the WTO website. I think so. So don't be worried about taking note of everything. So after this positive example, we chose to highlight, we have some challenges in the region, and I brought here some numbers to share with you. The size of the challenge I brought in the next 4 slides. So we have 0 is the number of Latin American countries that have a written policy that implements the TBT agreement within the national regulatory processes for medical devices. 0 is also the number of Latin American medical device regulatory authorities that formally and specifically recognize the WTO TBT definition of technical regulation, standard, and conformity assessment. I believe that last year when we were at the TBT committee, we mentioned this a little bit, and we confirmed that over the past 1.5 years, how the regulatory authorities and the trade negotiators are not connected in many countries. So there is a lack of understanding from the regulatory side of the TBT, for example, the TBT definitions, the TBT commitments that the countries have made. And we have been pursuing and trying to educate together with the governments and together with the private sector through workshops in the region about the importance of the trade side of the discussion for the regulatory side of the discussion. So this has been an ongoing challenge for us, but also a very rewarding experience, since we have seen countries more and more engaged in this discussion with us. So, and I just highlighted here that not even the latest published quality infrastructure law in Mexico, that is very new on good regulatory practices, has highlighted the TBT definition, the WTO TBT definitions. More challenges. One is the number, and it is Brazil, the number of Latin American medical device regulatory authorities that have implemented the WHO recommendations for modern regulatory frameworks and regulatory reliance for medical devices. And 3 countries, Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia, are the number of medical device regulatory authorities engaged in international medical device regulatory convergence initiatives. More challenges, and this is one very close to our heart because it's a big challenge. 10 is the number of Latin American medical device regulatory authorities that still require a consularized apostille of an original paper document confirming information already available online. And we are really struggling with that. Another big challenge of the region, especially if you compare with the structure that the United States have, the number of Latin American medical device regulatory authorities staff range from 5 to 50 personnel staff involved specifically with medical devices, regulatory issues, versus 2,000 for example, in the United States and Food and Drugs Administration. COFEPRIS in Mexico, for example, told us that they have between 40 people, personnel for medical devices, and 100 people for drugs, for pharmaceuticals. So that's another challenge. And also, it's important to bear in mind that not only the medical devices regulators in Latin are required to work on international standards, but also demanded to develop country unique requirements. So it's very complicated, the scenario nowadays currently in Latin America. And just to finalize, we have some urgent recommendations we are making to governments, to companies, to associations engaged in our work. So it's the documentation and regular reporting to WTO on implementation of good regulatory practice policy and related standard operating procedures by health regulators, implementation of recognition and reliance for pre-market and post-market activities, WHO guidance, regulatory processes, standardization, adoption of international best practices, and emergency convergent pathways for pre-market authorizations and post-emergency management. I'll finalize here, and I don't know if we are going to have time for questions and answers, but I'll wrap up here, Devin, and I hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Renata. I think that was really interesting, and we saw the progress, but also still the size of the challenge that remains. So I think that was really useful. Indeed, we've gone a bit over time, but we have quite a number of questions. So maybe I'll just pose one question to the panel in general. It's one question that was directed to, actually, I think to Matthew specifically, but I think it's open to all speakers. So the question is, how do you achieve trust between regulatory authorities in order to accelerate the regulatory approvals of medicines, medical devices, et cetera? And this, I think the question is also recognizing the fact that countries have very different levels of regulatory frameworks in place. And I think it's something that we started with at the very beginning, the need for confidence and trust. So what from your point of view can we do to build that up and to better prepare the world for future emergencies and pandemics? So I'm not sure if anyone wants to take the floor or jump in there. I see Matthew, I see you are there on the screen, so I'll give you the floor first.
Well, thank you for the question. And I'll just say two quick things about that subject. I mean, obviously, confidence is the key, and it is not earned lightly. I mean, when you're talking about the safety of people, of citizens, governments have to take their time to establish that trust. But I think throughout the different presentations we've heard, there's a lot of understanding that these are common problems that every country faces, and there's a wide variety of resources available to different governments. And I think that it's through increments and through creating the reality that this is a good activity. So in the Canadian side, I think every regulator understands the value of learning from others in their field who are doing the same thing. But everyone is very busy, and it's very hard to make time sometimes to learn from others when you are stuck with approving so many products. And so one of the things we've learned is that the creating structures to make it a regular practice, to make it a regular part of doing business, bears fruit over time. So we have a central regulatory policy where we encourage, not only in the area of health, but in all areas, our regulators to cooperate with others in other countries. And I mentioned that we've created some standing agreements that are not limited to one domain or one sector, that can include health, but they include other areas as well, so that there are tools available for regulators to reach out. And if you are regulating a specific technology, but you do not know how to go about this exercise of engaging another government, me and my colleagues in the Foreign Ministry are able to help those domestic departments by saying we have a toolkit available, we have the means to connect with other governments, and we have a standing arrangement to do so. When there's an area where you're identifying, particularly perhaps a new technology that needs to be looked at, if other governments are all looking at it at the same time, great, you can take advantage of those things. And my earlier example about the single audit program, it now has many countries participating, but it began with a very simple exercise of 2 countries doing a single audit for a single product and seeing how it works, then building on it, and then adding more products, and then adding more countries. And so in that model, it does take some time to grow the confidence, but it also accelerates, and you get a snowball effect where over time you have more and more products. And in 15 years, we've gone from 1 product to 5,800 sites for this single device audit. So I think there's some good progress there. And I also hope from all of the emergency measures we've heard discussed today, that so many more people will have been exposed to the value of sharing that confidence during the pandemic, and that there will be a lasting impact in a positive way, which a number of speakers have alluded to.
Thank you very much. Dr. Doer, I see you have your video on. Maybe I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think this element of building trust is really critical in building these approaches of relying on one another. And if you have time to look at the WHO guidance that has been developed and published, you will find that trust is listed there as one of the enablers for reliance. And obviously, there's a lot of work. How we say it's like there's investment needed first before you can benefit from reliance, because the confidence building takes time. It also takes some efforts, for example, starting with sharing of information, of assessment reports, to be able to look at the work that other regulatory authorities are doing, then moving on to joint activities, as it's done in many parts of the world. And the colleague from Kenya is also well aware of the work that's done in the Eastern African community on joint assessments. This also are means to get to know each other, get to know the work that others are doing and the level and the quality of the work that others are doing. And with that comes trust, like going forward to rely on a regulatory authority that you have seen, the expertise that is there, the output that is being produced, and then with the trust being established, being able to implement these reliance approaches. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if any other speakers would like to jump in now. I see Pauline, you're there, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And yes, I think the element or what Dr. Doer has really picked up on is true, that we started to see a lot of positive reliance and understanding of systems when, especially through the ESC, when you know what the other is doing. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the MDF task force, we were able to share documents as colleagues. We had WHO technical experts, we had members from NRA, we had invited experts from other harmonization initiatives. But at that forum, we worked more as colleagues, as teammates. And through that, the documents that were developed, the standard operating procedures, it was very easy to disseminate, and the uptake with the other members was much more softer, so to use or to speak with regards to being able to have trust built amongst countries. So I believe that's a really key area, working together, being able to share and show what the other is doing so with a lot of confidence, and also having that the technical experts from all areas, WHO, local NRAs, being able to feel confident in what you're doing, and being able to know that what you're doing is actually the right thing to do, and therefore you're sort of encouraged. It gives you the encouragement to be able to do it long after the process has done. For example, now speak to the standard operating procedures that were developed. A lot of countries, including Kenya, we use them in reporting substandard and falsified products, and that is across to Tanzania, our neighbor, Uganda. All the countries that did not have those materials have been able to adopt them and domesticate them, which is a really positive way of accelerating regulatory cooperation and ensuring that we can also speak to each other after such forums. For example, whenever a product is picked up in terms of a counterfeited product or suspected case, if it's picked up in Kenya, we will be able to speak to fellow regulators across the border, and it may not always go through the official channels, but sometimes simply because we have built trust and a relationship, I can ask offline before then making it an official complaint that such and such product has come into a market, and we're looking to be able to. Previously, that has not been the practice, that has not been the process and procedure. So as we move forward, working together, ensuring that we can share our processes, ensuring that we know and that we feel whatever is being done is right, and really where it's not right, encouraging for the right process and procedure to be followed is really done. Like Dr. Dor has said, it's an investment. Every day we have to be able to keep at it and ensure that at the end of the day, all of us are on the same page.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varimo. And I think it's, that's a very interesting example on how you have that kind of informal connection and working together that makes this work. Dr. Amaral, I think I see you have your video on. I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I completely agree with what the other speakers have mentioned. And one thing that we have been doing at the coalition, I commented really quickly, is trying to organize tailor-made workshops, country by country, according to the country's needs, told to us by the governments and by the private sector. And we are trying to build these opportunities to share experiences and to learn together on regulatory affairs, on regulatory cooperation and convergence at the end of the day, but also on the trade language, and specifically the TBT language to regulators. So I think this is something that we are seeing some positive outcomes now. For example, the e-ping tool that you have at the WTO, we are trying to educate everyone to use it, to be transparent, and telling them that transparency is also something very important for all the system to work for everyone. So this is something we have been doing on an ongoing basis with countries and focusing on their specific needs on each workshop. So I think this has been helping a lot.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if any of the other speakers still here online would like to just come in and say a last word, because I think soon we'll have to wrap up. I'm not sure if any of them would like to jump in now. Just turn on your camera if you would like to, and then I will see you. Maybe not. So maybe then I think it's now time to wrap up our discussion. And I just want to say thank you so much to all of the panelists that we've had. It's really been enlightening, very, very, very useful discussion from my point of view. I've learned a huge amount. And to all the participants who've joined us, thank you so much. I think it's very difficult to summarize all of this. I think it will take some time to digest. But one of the things that I would take away is that certainly there's been a lot of progress, and I think that's what many have said. Many of the speakers mentioned this, that we've done a lot in the last 5-10 years in this space of regulatory cooperation on medical products. But I guess that there is still as well some more that can be done. There are many common problems, I think, that are faced. And I think that some of the barriers and challenges are and opportunities there. Of course, some may be specific to certain sectors or products, whether we're talking about medical devices or production of generic pharmaceuticals. But I think indeed one of the things that was certainly strongly mentioned as well was aligning more with international standards and utilizing the existing structures that we have, whether those are regional arrangements or more global arrangements between regulators, to try to make everyone's work easier. And I think one of the key points that I would take away as well is the fact that there is scarce resources, scarce regulatory capacity. And to use that efficiently, we can work together. And if we can work together more, that really ultimately it's, about keeping people safe and healthy at the end of the day. So it will help regulators do their job better. I think looking forward as well, we had quite a number of comments about how we learn from what's happened in this pandemic, the lessons, and some of the emergency actions that were taken, some of the practices that were put in place. Could those be made more permanent, or could we draw lessons from those to think about guidance for the future, for future pandemics looking ahead? So I think those are open questions that should be considered further as we think, as we try to learn more from this experience of COVID-19 and regulatory cooperation. So with that, I would end the webinar and say thank you again very much to our distinguished panelists. We really appreciate your contribution. And thank you again for joining us, to all the participants. And I hope you stay safe and well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Devin. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Devin.
Thank you.